This episode is about AI. And before you roll your eyes and assume this is another essay telling you that AI is going to save the world or take your job or replace your therapist or marry your partner or make your morning coffee, it isn't. Underneath it, this piece isn't actually about AI. It's about what happens when something new arrives and threatens the story we've been telling ourselves about who we are, how valuable we are, and where we fit. It's about fear, status, identity, and why some of the loudest arguments about tech are rarely about technology at all. So if you're ready, let's get into it. This is You Hate AI. Good. That makes you the control group. If I told you that I used AI to help write this, some of you would feel something shift, a contradiction, a judgment forming before the thought had time to finish. That reaction is the subject of this piece, not the AI, not the ethics of AI, that reaction itself. Because there's a study that measured it, and what it found explains something I think a lot of you already know, but haven't had the language for. This is for the people who've already read the room, the ones who are using the tools, building with them, creating things in real time that didn't exist 6 months ago. The ones who are getting increasingly tired of defending that decision to people who think AI is like the internet, or like email, or like some other historical analogy they can hold at arm's length and evaluate on their own terms. It's not. Those comparisons assume something is still being negotiated, something you can opt into when you're ready. AI is not happening. It has happened. And the difference between those two tenses is the whole argument. To some, this may be a grim way to open an essay, but stay with me. It was actually a perfect death. Last May, I held my dog in my parents' garden as the vet administered the lethal injection directly into her heart. We were lying underneath an apple tree with blossoms falling on us and a light breeze rolling up the garden, and the sky was this perfect, obscene blue, and I was whispering what a good dog she was in her ear when I noticed a little rush of blood come back into the syringe before he slowly compressed the plunger. And in that moment I knew, whatever I did, however much I didn't want it to be happening, however much I wanted to change my mind and give her a few more days, that decision point was gone. It was irreversible. These were our last seconds, and apart from the grief that only people who've loved an animal would understand, I remember a very specific feeling underneath it. The feeling of something that's over, even though she hadn't actually died yet. A dead dog walking. The drug is in the bloodstream. From this point forward, there's only the ride. I had an adjacent feeling the first time I used AI properly. I remember telling my husband about this new tech I'd found on some random Reddit threads, and the poor man had to hear about it for months because I was so emphatic about it. Not excited, emphatic, because I knew something had shifted. Something was dead, and we were in that transition where no matter what you want to be true, however skeptical you are, however much you'd prefer to wait and see, the plunger has been depressed. The drug is in the bloodstream. And from this point forward, there were only ever two choices. Accept it and find a way to live within the new normal, or pretend that there are other options and wait for that new normal to beat you into submission. If you've already read the room and accepted it, what follows is the framework, the vocabulary, the pattern underneath the resistance you keep running into from people who are still pretending that there are other options. You'll finally have the words for that. And if you're one of the people who is still pretending, you can stay too, but I'm not writing this for you. I'm writing it in front of you. There's a difference. I'll also publish a full list of the prompt stacks, chains and AI tools used and exactly how I've used them. The behind the scenes breakdown is available to paid subscribers as part of my commitment to showing my working. Because if this article argues that AI collaboration is no different, in kind from working with a human editor or a copywriter or a publicist or a marketing team or production staff, then the least I can do is show you exactly what that collaboration looks like. In 2023, a study published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B give people a foraging task. Navigate an environment, find resources, decide when to move on. The kind of decisions humans have been making for 200,000 years. The participants with neurodivergent traits abandoned depleted resources faster. They moved on sooner and they collected more food overall. The participants without those traits stayed longer kept harvesting the same ground after the returns had thinned, because the patch was familiar and the cost of evaluating a new one felt like more than they were willing to pay. And that study is not about food. Not really. Your resistance to AI, or the resistance you keep encountering, is not a position anybody arrived at through careful thought. It's a foraging strategy, a cognitive behaviour with a neurological signature, an evolutionary history, and a measurable relationship to how the brain processes the difference between this is still valuable and this is familiar. Those two things are not the same thing, but the brain treats them as the same thing, and so people stay and the patch is empty. I need to tell you who's talking because I think that context matters for what comes next. I was diagnosed as neurodivergent in my mid-40s, which means I spent roughly 4 decades in environments that weren't built for the way that my brain works. Being told in ways both direct and structural that the mismatch was my deficit. Sit still, think linearly, follow the process, produce work in the format that we expect, at the pace we expect, in the shape we recognise. And if you can't do that, the problem's you. You're not putting in the effort. You're taking the difficult route as a choice, not the system, not the environment, you. And there's a load with that, a tax, a weight, a cost. 4 decades of it, 4 decades of performing the format rather than the thinking. Because the format is the price of admission and nobody's interested in what's happening underneath. And so I learnt to mask so well that by the time anybody thought to check, there wasn't actually anything visible to check for, which is the whole problem with high functioning anything. The better you perform, the less anybody believes that the performance is costing you. And so I built workarounds. I've recorded hundreds of hours of my own spoken language voice notes, long, sprawling, recursive voice notes, where my brain does what it actually does when nobody's watching, which is think in spirals and returns and sudden landings. I've trained AI on those transcripts, the specific patterns of how I think, not the ideas, the rhythms, the architecture of how I build an argument or abandon it, or circle back, or pick it up from a different angle. And I always find something that I couldn't have reached by going there straight. And so when I write now, I'm collaborating with tools trained to keep up with the way that my mind actually moves, instead of forcing my mind into the shape that a blank page prefers. That's not different in kind from working with a live editor. It's not different from dictating to a secretary, which is how plenty of the 20th century's most celebrated authors actually work. And nobody rushes to call that fraud because it doesn't disturb their fantasy of genius. Shall we burn all the books written by ghostwriters while we're at it? The snobbery I keep seeing, especially in places like Substack, is often coming from people who have never published anything of consequence, while conveniently ignoring how much supposedly pure creation has always been collaborative. Editors reshape books. Uncredited hands influence structure, tone, pacing, argument. Whole chapters, and especially endings, are changed. Musicians use producers, session players, co-writers, mixing engineers, remastering. Politicians use speechwriters. TED speakers use coaches, producers, rehearsal teams. Honestly, get a grip. The work was never as solitary as people pretend. But the moment the collaborator is a new software, suddenly it's fraud. Explain the principle to me. Not the feeling, the principle. You can't, because there isn't one. There's a feeling. And the feeling is, if a machine can help him do what I do, then what I do may not be as special as I thought. And that feeling, that specific contradiction, is a thing that I keep coming back to, because it's the same contradiction that has appeared at every significant tech threshold throughout human history. And do you know what? It's never once prevented the threshold from being crossed. I want to talk about patterns, not the interesting kind, the fucking embarrassingly tedious, boring kind, the kind that repeats with such grinding, humiliating predictability that the only interesting question left is why some folks still can't fucking see it. When you're the one with something to lose, the end of your advantage always looks like the end of the world. That's the pattern. That's the whole thing. I could give you 2,500 years of examples, but I'll give you 3 primary ones, because 3 is enough to see it. Take the printing press. The Catholic Church, right, was so certain that ordinary people reading scripture without a man providing priestly influence would unravel Western civilization. They fought it hard, banned books, excommunicated printers. They were right in a way. It did destroy their social order. What it didn't destroy was civilization. It destroyed their monopoly on who gets to participate in it. Did they see that distinction? Let's play nice and say that they couldn't see that distinction, and that they couldn't see it because they were the ones with something to lose. When you're the one with something to lose, the end of your advantage always looks like the end of the world. Calculators. Teachers were certain that if children could get the answer without working through the steps, arithmetic would die, numeracy would collapse. Schools banned them, some still do. Mathematics didn't collapse. What happened was that the nature of mathematical competence shifted. The mechanical skill was replaced by the conceptual skill. The ability to do long division by hand becomes less important than the ability to understand when long division is the appropriate operation. And the people who had built their professional identity around the mechanical skill experienced that shift as a loss. Because it was a loss, just not the kind that they said it was. Social media and smartphones, best-selling books out there, parents buying flip phones, a Luddite club formed in New York where Gen Z kids sit in parks reading paperbacks as a matter of principle. And the research across multiple meta-analyses has been inconclusive at best. The effect sizes, when they exist, are roughly equivalent to the effect of eating potatoes. But the feeling around social media and smartphones, the feeling was real. The feeling was, I cannot control what my child pays attention to, and that feels like danger, and I need a villain, and any villain will do. 3 centuries, 3 technologies, and every single time the same inability to distinguish, this threatens what I value, or this threatens my position as the person who gets to define what's valuable. And now there's AI, and now there's you, standing in the same spot with the same certainty, reaching for the same moral language. The panic has never prevented adoption, not once. Not about industrialization, about writing, printing, CDs, streaming, electricity, telephones, radio, space travel, comic books, television, calculators, video games, the internet. The technology arrives, the panic arrives. The technology stays, the panic moves on to the next thing. And a generation later, the panickers' children can't imagine a world without the thing that their parents tried to ban. And the parents eventually adopt it, like they were always on board. Yawn. Fucking yawn. It's not a theory, it's a pattern with a sample size of 2,500 years. And the question isn't whether you're in it. You are. The question is whether you can see it from the inside. And the neurologically honest answer is probably not, because that's what the foraging study actually showed. The people who stayed at the depleted patch didn't know it was depleted. They just knew it was familiar, and familiar felt safe. The science underneath this actually is specific enough for us to be uncomfortable. We've got things like loss aversion. We first found out about this theory in 1979 about loss aversion. And what it means is that you feel the pain of losing something roughly twice as intensely as the pleasure of gaining something equivalent. Status quo bias, that we became familiar with in about 1988. That means that you prefer the current state of affairs even when the change would serve you better. Not because the current state is better, but because it's known to you. And that's huge, isn't it? You prefer the current state of affairs even when change is better. And not because the current state is better, but because it's familiar to you. Your brain, our brains, are always running in energy saving mode. And evaluating new options, thinking about uncertain futures, it costs us mentally, it costs cognitive resources. Status quo bias is saying staying costs almost nothing. And so therefore, people do fuck all about it. Honestly, as a neurodivergent person, I often experience my environment and how people move through it in the way I imagine an alien would. Watching the staying behaviour from outside, and this research both explains something I'd always observed about neurotypical thinking and frightened me, because it means the staying isn't a choice, it's a default. And defaults are really hard to override. But in evolutionary terms, I completely acknowledge it serves a purpose. Every group needed the people who maintained the camp while the scouts went out. The ones who kept the fire going, stored food, organised systems, maintained routines, the breeders. Continuity has value. Somebody has to keep the thing running while somebody else goes out looking for the next thing. But the Sentinel hypothesis, published in the same journal as the foraging study, identifies the neurodivergent brain as the one that kept the group alive while everybody else slept. Novelty seeking, environmental scanning, wide-angled attention that catches the thing in the periphery that doesn't fit the pattern. Columbia University frames these traits as adaptive advantages in pre-agricultural societies. These traits, and the person who couldn't concentrate was actually concentrating on everything simultaneously. The person who can't sit still was exploring the environment with a physical intensity that would have been unremarkable 10,000 years ago. The person who abandons the depleted food source first, that's the scout. That's always been the scout. And so here's the reversal, and I need you to sit in it because it's significant. This is my version of shouting back at the old food patch. It's running out. There'll be less next season. There isn't enough to go around anymore. The soil is depleted. The climate has changed. The fresh resources are over the next valley. I know because I went looking. I fell out of a tree twice. I slid down a riverbank. I came back filthy. But it's there. I've seen it. The World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report lists the emerging economy and what it will actually need. Analytical thinking, resilience, flexibility, pattern recognition, rapid context switching, comfort with ambiguity. I read that list and I laughed, and then I didn't laugh because I've spent my whole professional life being told that those exact traits were problems. The person whose brain was running 6 threads simultaneously and can't shut 5 of them down. I sat in rooms being assessed by people whose entire cognitive advantage was their ability to do things linearly. And I performed linearly, for them. And it cost me. It cost me something that I'm still calculating. And now we have the World Economic Forum publishing reports that say the thing my brain was always doing is the most valuable thing a brain can do in the emerging markets. The overlap between the neurodivergent cognitive profile and what the WEF calls most sought after is significant enough to state plainly the traits that were pathologized for a century are becoming the most valuable cognitive assets in the global economy. And the traits that were rewarded, linear processing, procedural compliance, sustained, narrow focus, predictable output, those are the ones machines can do better than humans. That's what's being automated, not creativity, not insight, not the weird lateral leaps. The machine stuff. The tool doesn't fix the brain. The brain was never broken. The tool fixes the environment. The UK Department for Business and Trade found that neurodivergent workers reported significantly higher satisfaction with AI assistance than their neurotypical colleagues. The productivity gains aren't marginal. In some of those studies, they're dramatically larger for a neurodivergent user than anybody else. And I don't find that surprising. I find it obvious because the tool's doing something that no workplace tech has done before. Bending to the brain instead of demanding the brain bend to it. And if you spent 40 years bending, you know what that relief feels like. You know exactly what it's worth. And the people whose brains always fit the old format, the ones who could think linearly, produce work in expected shape, follow the process without friction, they want to restrict the tool. They're reaching for moral language, craft language. Think of the humanity language. And if you've already moved, you've heard it, you know the tone. But what it means, whether they know it or not, is the system that rewarded my cognitive profile is being replaced by one that doesn't. And I experience that as a threat to something essential, because I've never had to separate my advantage from my identity. Which is what I mean about the depleted patch. That's the patch they're defending. The system valued their specific cognitive style and it's emptying. Not because anybody decided to empty it, but because the environment has shifted. Now, there are completely valid objections to AI, and I hold many of them. And not the panicking moralist from the historical catalogue objections, but the version that comes from somebody who's actually thought about it. And there are people who've actually thought about it, and they deserve better than being lumped in with this anti-AI, it's going to destroy us, AI slop, let's do fuck all club. AI, let's have it right, is being deployed by companies and their primary obligation is to their shareholders, not to the artist whose style was scraped into a training data set without their consent. There is a problem. The concentration of this much capability in this few hands is a total societal structural risk. There's the speed of this deployment. It's outrunning the capacity of any government or any regulatory body to keep pace. And then there's labour displacement. That is very real. Tufts project 9.3 million jobs vulnerable in 2 to 5 years. And those are real people with real mortgages and kids. So telling them just learn the tools isn't the answer. It's a dismissal by some AI sales prick in loafers and a polo shirt. And the consent problem's worse than most pro-AI voices will admit. The people building these systems took creative work that wasn't theirs and turned it into a product. That isn't moral panic. That is dressing up IP theft as innovation. And with all of that, I don't pretend to have a clean fix. And anybody that tells you that they do is pissing on your back and telling you it's raining. And the thing is, the complicated adult thing is, all of that's true. This distinction between it has dangers and it should be stopped are still different sentences. The inability to hold them as separate claims is itself, to me, a diagnostic. It's this flattening, this reduction of a multi-dimensional problem into a binary good or bad, for or against, human or machine. And that flattening isn't intelligence. To me, anyway, it's the cognitive equivalent of staying at that depleted food source, because evaluating new positions requires holding uncertainty. And we already know that uncertainty is cognitively expensive. And so the brain would rather be wrong and certain than right and unsettled. Nuclear physics give us energy, but it also give us Hiroshima. The printing press give us scientific literacy, but it also give us propaganda. You know how this list goes. Every significant tech has been both a tool and a weapon. The question was never should it exist, because it was going to exist regardless. The question was always who builds the frameworks around it, and are the right people in the room when that happens. I use the tools, and I want accountability from the companies that build them. And I fight for the people being displaced by them. And I benefit from them personally. And I hold all of that without collapsing it to fit a bitchy social media post. And if that sounds like a contradiction to you, the contradiction is the point. The ability to hold contradictory frameworks without flattening them. Certainly without flattening them into some false certainty. That's the cognitive trait. That's what the movers must do. The question isn't whether AI is dangerous. It is. Arnie himself warned us, didn't he? I'll be back. The question is whether the resistance is about those dangers or it's about feelings. The depleted patch, right? It's not just a metaphor. I know I've thoroughly ripped the arse out of it, but I keep coming back to it because for the typicals I wanted a familiar conceptual vehicle, something stable enough to hold them in place while I jump around and push at their worldview and refuse the neat linear route they usually trust. But it works, certainly from my perspective, as more than a device. It works as a diagnostic. And not just for AI, it applies to careers, business models, org structures, and the professional identities people build in a world that no longer exists. It's staying too long and putting up with the environment. And is that a pattern for you? Jobs, relationships, friendships, finances, well-being, mental health, physical health. If you're a person who's already moved, you will have seen this and you recognise it in the people around you, but you haven't had the language for it. So here it is. They're working harder for less. They can feel the returns are thinning, but leaving would mean evaluating an unfamiliar landscape, and that evaluation feels like more work than staying. Even though staying is costing more, the effort of staying has become invisible to them. Because it's been constant for so long, they've forgotten that it's effort. They think that it's just the job. Then there's the language, isn't there? They're using moral language or identity language to describe what's actually a strategic position. I believe in craft. Right, maybe they do, but it might also be a way of saying the specific craft I mastered is losing market value and I don't want to learn a new one. And those are really different things, wearing the same clothes, but they're different. And here's a test for that. If somebody offered them the same creative satisfaction and the same financial return, though the method was one that they didn't recognise, would they take it? And if the answer is no, they're not defending a principle, they're defending a self-image. And there's a weight with knowing that, even if that's about yourself. Underneath both of those, the thing that I keep seeing, people mistake familiarity with quality. You know, the format that you know feels right because you've been rewarded for it. The format you don't know feels wrong because it's untested to you. I've been rewarded for this, and this is the best way to do it. Are different claims. The first's about history. I've been rewarded for this. The second's about the landscape. This is the best way to do it. And let's be super fucking clear. It's already happened. You know, 3 questions worth putting to anybody, including yourself. What would you do if the thing you're defending disappeared tomorrow? Not what would you lose? What would you do? And if you don't know, you've been tending that scabby patch so long that you've forgotten how to scan. So are you resisting this because you've evaluated it, or because evaluating it feels like a loss? Who benefits from your resistance? Your brain will present, I've evaluated this, and I don't want to evaluate this, as exactly the same feelings, and they're not. And again, that distinction is the whole game here. The movers don't wait for permission. They never have. They're not smarter than the people who stay. They're not braver than the people that stay. Their brains just process the cost benefit differently. They feel that depletion sooner. They tolerate the ambiguity of the new patch much more easily. And so they move. Not because moving is virtuous, because the patch is empty. And their neurology won't let them pretend otherwise. And when that all gets too heavy and too stressful, I just think, fuck it, we're ants, clinging to a rock, screeching through the vacuum of space to our inevitable extinction. Or as Bill Hicks once said, we're a virus with shoes. This one's dedicated to you, Mikey. You know what the Irish beekeeper says.